Welcome, everyone, to Local Heroes of the Underground Railroad. I am Sheila Budoff with Arlington County's 55 Plus program. This program is being recorded and will be posted on the 55 Plus YouTube channel at a later point as time permits. Our speaker will be spotlighted so that she is the only one who appears in the recording. You're viewing this program through the Virtual Center for Active Adults platform. The VCAA is a partnership of Northern Virginia jurisdictions that provide free virtual programming for older adults and adults with disabilities in our area. And now it's my honor and my privilege to introduce our special guest speaker for today's program. Our speaker's name is Jenny Masur. She worked for 17 years for the National Park Service as the National Capital Region Manager for the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom. She is an anthropologist with a doctorate in social anthropology from the University of Chicago. She has traveled all over the U.S. in order to identify and document people, places, and events related to the Underground Railroad. Her talk today will be based on her book, Heroes of the Underground Railroad Around Washington, D.C. Jenny has written another book entitled Maryland Freedom Seekers on the Underground Railroad, which was just published in January 2023. We're going to ask if you could please hold your questions until the end. You're most welcome to enter them in the chat as we go, but we will be addressing them at the end. And so now, without further ado, I will turn it over to our speaker, Jenny Masur.
It's a pleasure to be here to speak to all of you today and to be the kickoff speaker for Black History Month. As you all know, it's the month honoring Black history. And this book is really, I wanted to call it Local Unknown Heroes. And the reason was most people during Black History Month hear about Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass. And I said, well, even though they're both from Maryland, which is in the vicinity, there are a lot more people that you've never heard of. Now, there are a lot of people in the book, The Heroes of the Underground Railroad around Washington, D.C., that are from D.C., Maryland, and Virginia. And I could have picked any of them. I decided to pick one story of somebody who was a activist on the Underground Railroad and one story of a family that escaped on the Underground Railroad. So also I want to say that it's not going to all take place in the DC area, because you really have to look at where people started from and where they ended up, because they didn't usually stay in DC. It wasn't safe. Some people blended in with the Black population in DC, which was relatively large, but they were still at great risk. So often they moved north. And I guess I should also say, no, they did not all go to Canada, as you'll hear. The examples I have today went to Massachusetts, but during my work with the Park Service, we went all over the country to look at the history of the Underground Railroad. The Network to Freedom was established by Congress in order to emphasize local stories from all over the United States, from Hawaii to Texas to Florida to New Hampshire, you name it. I don't think every single state is in yet, but there are an awful lot of them. So with that, I think I'm going to start why I wrote the book. As you heard, I worked for the National Park Service for the Network to Freedom. That's what I call it for short. And I worked for them for all those years, and I had accumulated what I call stories. They're really documented historical narratives of many different people. And I wanted to be able to write them down so I could share them with people, besides the people that I spoke to on different occasions. And I was lucky enough to make contact with the History Press, and the book I published in 2019 as a result. The Maryland book is also with History Press, and it covers a variety of people. And the helpers were a variety of people. Some people helping were enslaved, some of them were free Blacks, some of them were whites, some of them were abolitionists, not all of them were abolitionists, some of them it was fortuitous. There was somebody in the barn, they weren't sure who, but they suspected it was someone trying to escape, and they decided not to interfere, and they may have just coincidentally left a bucket of milk in the barn by chance, so to speak. But they might not have been politically on the side of helping people escape. So you have a whole variety of life experiences. You have men and women, and there even were some teenagers and not very young children, but there were all kinds of people involved. Let's see, I'm going to go to the first. Oops. Now this is to emphasize the point of the cooperation of different ethnic and racial groups. There even were some cases of American Indian groups helping people escape. They're not really well documented yet, but people are working on it. And this is a group from the East Coast. There were what they called vigilance committees. The vigilance committees were formed in cities to help people who are arriving, escaping from slavery. And this is a photograph that it so happens is of the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee. As you can imagine, not everybody had photographs taken, either for protection of their identity or because not everybody went around having photographs taken in the 19th century. And you can see half of the people are Black and half of the people are white. And some of them are very well-known people, like Thomas Garrett, who was from Wilmington, Delaware. And you have Robert Purvis, who was from Philadelphia. And you have someone named William Still. Now, he's important because he was on the committee, and he was the person who greeted the people who were escaping from slavery. And he would take down the notes on what they said, why they came, where they came from, who they escaped from. And he also was trying to figure out who were the fakes and who were the real thing. Because on occasion there were people who were trying to figure out what the network was, and therefore, pretended to be freedom seekers, as we call them, people escaping slavery. So he kept his notes. Thomas Garrett, because of being in a big trial, burnt all his notes, and a lot of the other people who were helping burnt their notes because they didn't want to go to prison. But William Still kept his, and after the Civil War, he published them in 1872, and they are an excellent source on people who were involved in the Underground Railroad, both people who helped and people who were being helped. And so if any of you are interested, you should look for his book or one of the books about him. He's a fascinating person. His family came from the South, from Maryland, and ended up in New Jersey. And one of the people who passed by him when he was taking the notes turned out to be a long lost brother because his parents left where they were, and they had to leave a couple of their children behind. And he was born in New Jersey after the family arrived in New Jersey, so he never knew those siblings. So it's a very interesting book. Okay, I want to explain how I define the Underground Railroad. It was used as a metaphor. Underground railroad trains were something that was innovative in the 19th century. It was a little bit like spaceships for us, I imagine. And so people didn't really understand that much about them. And when people were escaping, they would say, oh, it's like they disappeared on an underground railroad. Well, despite Colson Whitehead's book, there was no railroad under the ground. That was just a metaphor. And I'm going to change the definition of Underground Railroad a little bit, because I don't want the people who were escaping, who were the reason for the Underground Railroad, to be ignored or underappreciated. So let's see if I can get this to move on. So taking a slightly different approach, I'll use what we used in the Park Service. The Underground Railroad is assisted and unassisted resistance to slavery through flight from the beginning of slavery until the 13th Amendment. Now, I say that because the stereotype is that people were always being helped. There were people who had the courage and the initiative to escape on their own, and as far as we know, they received no help. There were other people who did not get any help until they crossed the Mason-Dixon line. So you have to keep that in mind. It was much, and Washington was on the southern side of the Mason-Dixon line, so anybody who was helping in the Washington area was at great risk. Now, and I have here the 13th Amendment because you all know, I'm sure, living in the DC area, that DC had emancipation in April 1862. However, Virginia and Maryland didn't. So for a while, DC was a mecca for people who were escaping. In Maryland, slavery was not formally abolished until 1864, toward the end of the Civil War. And in Virginia, as far as I know, and maybe one of you can correct me, it was never abolished, or certainly not in the 19th century. What happened is, as the Union Army came into Confederate areas, they considered the enslaved people to be free, and the enslaved people would flock to them. And if they had to draw back, the enslaved people went with them. And so there were camps of people, including since many of you are from Arlington, I don't know if you know that at Arlington Cemetery, there was originally, at the time of the Civil War, something called Freedmen's Village. And that was a camp of these people who were fleeing from slavery to the troops, who then had to figure out where they should go. And one thing they did was set them up in camps. So the 13th Amendment is the big date for everybody in the country. All right, let's see if I can get the... Okay, these are some terms I'm going to use just so you know what I'm talking about. A freedom seeker is somebody who's escaping slavery. It's, instead of using the words runaway or fugitive, a fugitive implies someone who's broken the law. And the people who were escaping did not consider they had broken the law. They considered that there was a moral law that they were owners of themselves. To us, it's kind of horrifying to think about the fact that someone could own someone else, but that was the case up until the end of the Civil War. And I use the word freedom seeker because to use the word slave implies a permanent condition. And people who were so-called slaves were able to change their condition by escaping successfully. So that's the reason I don't consider that politically correct. I consider that respect for the people whose ancestors are being talked about, that they were not breaking the law, they were not somebody's property. And runaway, I don't know how many of you have seen a runaway ad. I don't know if this arrow shows. This is a runaway ad, $200, ran away from somebody in Upper Marlboro. It gives the name of the lady. Well, it doesn't give the name, but it refers to a lady, and her agent is down here. It gives the name of the person who ran away, his occupation, what he looked like, his manner of speech, and his appearance. And it says they will pay $100 if he's within 30 miles of home, and if more than 30 miles away, he'll get $200. Now, what happened to you if you were caught? It says here, provided he be secured in jail so that the owner gets him again. Well, you were caught and you were put in jail, and you were held in jail until your owner came to get you. And you may know that if you were in Washington or another big city in the United States and you were wandering around and somebody, not wandering, but going about your business, I guess I should say, and somebody came up to you and declared you were an escaped enslaved person, then you would be taken to the jail and stay in the jail until your owner came to claim you. Well, if you were free, you didn't have an owner to come to claim you. If you were lucky, you were able to get word to somebody who could help you and bring your freedom papers, or could bring someone who could vouch for the fact that you were a free person. If you weren't lucky, you were left in jail for a certain period of time, and then the jailer would advertise the fact that you were in jail and would sell you to the highest bidder in order to pay off your room and board for the time you'd been in jail. And if once you were sold into slavery. So that's what happened. And if you were an enslaved person, of course, you were liable to be sent back to slavery, even if you'd been living free in, say, in Washington for a number of years. Okay, enslaved versus slave, and then bondsman I use because I don't want to say slave, even though that was the term used in the 19th century and the 18th century. Bondsman suggests a legal relationship because it was federal and state law that people could be property of other people until some of the northern states started changing their laws. I use the term sympathizers, operators, or members of vigilance committees, so I don't use the word conductor if I can avoid it, or station master, or baggage, or packages, or whatever on the train. And I separate anti-slavery and abolitionists. As I said, abolitionists were political people who were against slavery, and anti-slavery might be somebody like a Quaker who did not want to break the law, but did not approve of slavery and was sympathetic to people who were trying to escape. Okay, let's see, next. Okay, you all have heard of the Mason-Dixon line, and I'm just in case you don't know where it ran. Here it is in red. It runs along Pennsylvania border and it goes along the Delaware border. So it's very pertinent for Maryland and Virginia and DC. The closest place to escape from Maryland and DC, and even from parts of Virginia, because West Virginia didn't exist. It was part of Virginia until the Civil War. It broke away as part of what was going on during the Civil War. Oops, that was not supposed to happen. And so we have Pennsylvania here, and the states in the North abolished slavery at different periods. Pennsylvania abolished it in 1780, New Hampshire and Massachusetts in 1783, Connecticut and Rhode Island in 1784, New York not till 1827, and apparently New Jersey never abolished it until the 14th Amendment, which is kind of surprising. So you can see if you were in DC or Maryland, Delaware was a slave state, but if you're on the Eastern Shore, you would probably want to go up through Delaware and go to either Pennsylvania or New Jersey. If you were in this side of the western shore of the Chesapeake Bay, you would go up to Pennsylvania probably. But I don't want to leave out the fact that we have all this water. We have the Chesapeake Bay, which is a major feature, and you're all aware of it. And we have the Potomac River. And the Chesapeake Bay goes into, you can go from the Chesapeake Bay to the Atlantic Ocean. And waterways were a very important means of escape. It's the stereotype is people stumbling through the forest and the fields trying to escape at night, being guided by the North Star. But some of them were going by canoe or on a ship, a sailing ship, or an ocean-going ship, and they were escaping that way. And if you were, your first choice, of course, was to know where you were going and hope that you were going to the north. But your second choice was to get on and go wherever the ship went and hope it was going north. And there were cases of people who were where it was not going north. There's a very interesting book about someone named John Parker. It could be a movie, and I don't know why it isn't, because he got on and the ship was going in the wrong direction, and then he ended up in New Orleans, and who should he meet on the street but his owner? So, and I use the term owner because by law, that's what the person was. Okay. New Jersey, I said, didn't end slavery. It had gradual, what was called gradual abolition, which meant that they would do it by the age of the person. They pass laws at different points saying when somebody becomes 25 or 21, they'll be free, or something of that sort, so that it kept extending when, if you were born before that person became free, then you in turn had to wait until you were the 25 or 21 or whatever, so that extended slavery forever until the 13th Amendment. Okay, let's see, we'll keep moving. Now, I have this in here. It's a Civil War map, but I wanted you to see that Maryland and Virginia and DC were all one region. And this is geographically as well as because they're all in proximity. here you see the Potomac River, which is dividing Maryland from Virginia. It goes all the way up here. It goes to Cumberland, Maryland, and then to the mountains and the National Road, which takes you west. Here we have Harper's Ferry, which was Virginia. Here we have Charlestown, Leesburg, Fairfax, Falls Church, and here's Arlington House it has on here, but that wouldn't have been necessarily built yet. And this is Alexandria. Now it appears, I don't know why it keeps doing that. It appears as a large city because it was a city that pre-existed Washington, D.C., which was established in before 1800, just before 1800 in 1790. And it was a port. And you're going to hear about some people who escaped by a ship leaving Alexandria. Here we have Washington, we have Georgetown, and on this side, you can see here's Annapolis, Maryland's capital. It's right on the water. You have Baltimore up here. And way up here, you have the border with Pennsylvania all along here. So I'm pointing this out because people did not stay in one place in this region. People married someone from Maryland, married people from Virginia and vice versa. And sometimes they had houses in DC or in Alexandria or Annapolis. So they were scattered all over. And then their children would marry somebody else. And the dowry of the daughters might include enslaved people. And so that would go with the daughters when they got married. There would be inheritance when someone died, then the heirs would take the enslaved people to wherever they were currently living. So you get networks, both of the white slave owners and of the enslaved people. Now that's important because that means they're networks of information and personal networks. If you're trying to escape or you're trying to help someone escape, it's very important that you have ties to people in other places. And surprisingly, perhaps, the enslaved people had ties because they were moved around, whether they wanted to be moved or not. They traveled with their owners. They were serving meals to the owners, and they were often assumed to be invisible. So things were talked about, and it wasn't considered apparent that they would be listening and kind of taking mental notes. And people would run into each other, enslaved people at markets. When the owner traveled, remember George Washington traveled to Philadelphia regularly from Virginia, and some of the other people who were in the Constitutional Convention. So that should give you an idea of people moving around all through this area. And so you see in the runaway ads, they'll say, George may have run to Washington where he has a father, or to Annapolis where he has a brother, or to where he used to live in Baltimore. And that should give you an idea of the fact that these people did not stay in one place, neither the whites or the blacks. Okay. Now, Washington was a slave city. I think at least I used to forget that because it's the nation's capital. And right now, it's not considered part of the South. This is a typical poster that was produced by an abolitionist group. It calls Washington the slave market of America. And it shows pictures of a slave market A prison is where, as I said, if you were caught having run away or were a free person who was caught as a person who'd run away, you would be put in the prison. And that became an issue in Congress because that meant the federal government, in some cases, like in DC, was paying for the prisons in which the free people were put. And that was considered a bad use of federal money. You have Alexandria Harbor, and then you have some people who are being marched down south and so forth. So it says District of Columbia, land of the free, home of the oppressed. And people who came to DC from the North or from a foreign country were shocked. There were enslaved people in the markets, in the streets. They were working in hotels. They were working in private people's homes as domestic servants. Even people who did not own enslaved people might hire them as labor. They were working, building the Capitol and the White House, you name it, they were doing it, and you couldn't avoid seeing them. You also could not avoid seeing the slave traders at work, seeing the people being marched, as I'm going to show you in the next slide. You can see this is what was called a coffle. It's a set of people who are going to be sold at a slave market. The men are chained together in front. The women and children are not chained, but they're trailing behind. But I don't know if you can see, there's somebody right here and he's got a whip, so they can't easily slip away. And to remind you where this is, I don't know if you can see this in the back. That is actually the Capitol before it was finished. Those are the two domes that are not domes yet. So this was a site that was very upsetting to people who were not pro-slavery who came to Washington. They did not think that things like this should occur in the nation's capital, the home of the free. Okay, now this is I'm going to tell you my first story, so to speak. Leonard Grimes is one of my favorite heroes. He was an African American. He was born in Leesburg. We know that by the age of 12, he was free and his parents were free. We don't know whether he was born enslaved. As a young teen, he moved to Washington, D.C. He worked for a pharmacist, apothecary, he worked for a butcher, and then he started working for someone who was a slave owner. Now, if you would think that having lived in Leesburg and D.C., he would have a very good idea of what slavery was like. However, according to the story, he was traveling with his employer. He was in North Carolina, and he saw a woman being whipped because she would not leave her dying child to go to work. And at that point, he became so disgusted that he quit his job, took his savings, and set himself up in business. Now, if you were African American in Washington, you couldn't do just any occupation. One of the occupations that was open to you by law was being what was called a hack driver. That's the equivalent of being a taxi driver with a horse and carriage. And it was very convenient. Actually, he was interested in helping people escape, and he was able to use his carriage business as a cover for helping people escape from slavery. was actually not living in Virginia when he was doing this. He was living in DC. He owned property that he earned with his earnings from the carriage business. He owned property on what is now the campus of George Washington University. And there is a plaque that is kind of hidden in the corner of a park there. And I took some people on a tour and we went by there and I said, that's Leonard Grimes' plaque. And Leonard Grimes was blah, 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 blah. And they said, oh, so that's Leonard Grimes Park. And I said, no, it's not. It's Pushkin Park, because that's what the university calls it. But ever since I found out about Leonard Grimes, I was hoping I could get the university to do something. And eventually they put this plaque up. And my name is on the plaque at the bottom because I gave them some money to put the plaque up. So this is at 22nd and H Street Northwest. And that's the remaining trace of Leonard Grimes in DC. Now, he was working as a carriage driver, as I said, but in 1840, a rumor started spreading that he had helped a woman named Patty and her children who were enslaved escape to freedom. And the word got to the person, Joseph Meade, who claimed these people who had escaped. And he blamed Leonard Grimes. So Leonard Grimes, the warrant was issued. Leonard Grimes was arrested. And as you can imagine, he did not get a fair trial. The evidence was extremely weak. It was that he drove his carriage with the blinds down without stopping at his usual stop outside of Leesburg, on his way from Leesburg to Washington. And I don't think today that would be accepted in court as convincing evidence. However, despite the fact that some of his customers and other people wrote letters of recommendation and swore in court to his good character, he got 2 years in the Richmond Penitentiary. And that meant he had to leave his family behind. He had to leave his business behind. He had to be subject to hard labor in the prison. And you can imagine he would have been distraught. However, something important happened to him that changed his life. He had a religious awakening, and he was so motivated that he started preaching to the jailer and to the other prisoners. And when the 2 years of his imprisonment were up, he went back to Washington and he became licensed as a preacher, which is what they used to do. He was a Baptist. So there were, I'm going to talk about Quakers in a little bit, but there were more religious groups involved than just the Quakers. You can see here there are Black Baptists, there are Black Methodists, AME Methodists, there are people of a variety of backgrounds, Unitarians. It depended on the part of the country you were in, which groups were supporting helping people escape from slavery. So that's one point I want to make. I want to try and dispel some of the stereotypes people have. So this is where he was living. He came back. Let's see what the next one is. This is where his trial was, 1840. Apparently, Patty got to Canada in 1839, according to a newspaper. And later, at the time, he did not admit that he had been involved in the escape, but later he did admit it. And he said he got involved because Patty's husband, who was free, came to him and said, I really want my wife and children to enjoy freedom in Canada. And so he agreed to help them escape, but he paid a price for it. Okay, and you can see this looks like a Southern courthouse because it is a Southern courthouse. Okay, where did they go? Well, they had to stay and pay off debts. But once they paid off their debts, they didn't stick around Washington. They headed north and they went to New Bedford, which is where Leonard Grimes's aunt and uncle had gone. The aunt and uncle had been living in Washington, had come from Leesburg, and may have been involved with him in the Underground Railroad. We don't know if he was part of a network or he worked on his own. We do know that the aunt and uncle left DC precipitously after the Pearl Affair. And I don't know if you've heard of the Pearl Affair. It was one of the largest attempted escapes in the United States. It was an escape of about 70 people on a ship that left the Washington Harbor and was headed down the Potomac River to the Chesapeake Bay, and it got caught. At which point, apparently, the aunt and uncle fled, and they ended up in New Bedford before Grimes went there. So that, and I think another relative were perhaps the drawing card for him. But New Bedford, Massachusetts, was an important place on the map for people who were escaping to freedom. That it had a relatively large Black population. It had a relatively large Quaker population. It had jobs in the shipyards and on the whaling ships. And it was near the water. If you were really desperate, like somebody I talk about in my second book, you lied your way onto a whaling ship saying that you were capable at whatever job was being advertised. And once you were out at sea for 2 or 3 years, nobody could catch you. And that was one way to be safe. There are a number of documented cases of people who did that. And there may have been many more that we don't know about. Okay, so he gets to New Bedford, but he doesn't stay there very long because remember, he is a dedicated Baptist now. He is preaching. Oh, I don't know why this keeps doing this. He is preaching, and so that's why you see him here. He's now been ordained. He has become the pastor of this church, the Church of the Fugitive Slaves, and he's living on Beacon Hill in a community of abolitionists. And when he got to Boston, he was hired when he was in New Bedford to join a new church, which was a 12th Baptist church in Boston. And he was able to make the church prosper. It grew in size. It was able to build a nice church with a large capacity for a number of people. And he was able to make all kinds of contacts. Now, this was important because he was still devoted to being a Christian and being an Underground Railroad agent. So with his connections, he was able to help a lot of people. And now, this is one problem with doing slides is a lot of these, the people I talk about never had a image produced of them, either a photograph nor a print or a painting or anything of that sort. So I was able to find this. This is someone named Anthony Burns. He was part of a very famous fugitive slave case in 1854 in Boston. And he was caught, and despite large demonstrations of people, he was taken back south and sold to a new owner. And people in Boston, with the help of people like Grimes, raised the money to buy his freedom. And guess who went to Baltimore, which was risking himself because he was going into the South, remember, to meet the agent for the owner and hand over the check which had been raised in Boston. It was our friend Reverend Leonard Grimes. So anyway, typically to tell the story, you have all these little pictures here. You have the departure from Boston. You have the escape on shipboard when he gets to Boston by way of a steamship that goes between Richmond and Boston. And then you have pictures of him being auctioned and so forth. And so this is important because one way you know for sure somebody was involved in the Underground Railroad is what happened to them after they finished their brief and shining moment in the Underground Railroad. In this case, we know that Grimes went to Boston. He became the minister of a church called the Church of the Fugitive Slave. And he was involved in the Anthony Burns case. He was involved in the Shadrach Minkins case, among others. So he continued to be openly pro Underground Railroad. And remember, just because you were in Boston or New York or Philadelphia, which were in free states, you were not safe. You were safer than you were in the South, but you could be caught. There were two fugitive slave acts, one in 1793 that I'm going to mention later, and one in 1850, which is the one that's viable in this case. And that basically everybody was supposed to be helping people be returned to slavery. So that is the story of Leonard Grimes, and I picked him partly because he was an African American who was an activist on the Underground Railroad, and he was somebody we don't know whether he was working as part of a network or on his own. And I think that those are both very important things to remember. Okay, now I'm going to move on to a case of some freedom seekers. These people came from Fairfax County. I don't want you to think that all the stories that I had have something to do with Virginia and Massachusetts. It's just the two that I picked. If you were to look at the book, you'd see that people ended up all kinds of places. And I like to talk about the whole life of the person because you want to know what happened to them later. What did they make of their freedom? And did the connection with the Underground Railroad continue? So this is a couple named Mary and Arthur Cooper. You see their tombstones. Mary died in 1826. Arthur died in 1853. And the story starts in Alexandria Harbor. I'm going to give you an idea of how I tracked down some of these stories. I went to the Fairfax courthouse, and they have an archives. And in the archives, I said, do you have anything on the Underground Railroad? Well, when you're doing research on the Underground Railroad, it doesn't always do any good to say Underground Railroad because people don't connect it with slavery, escapes from slavery, and some of the big names who they did not realize were slave owners. So you really have to ask the questions a certain way. And they had a little file box of cards of African American cases that they had found in the court records. And one of them said that there was a case of the Coopers who had belonged to someone named Hancock Lee and had escaped on the ship, the Regulator, that was captained by someone named Samuel Chadwick. Samuel Chadwick came back to Alexandria, and as soon as he came back to Alexandria, the constables were on him, and he was tried, and we don't know what happened to him then. So that was what I had of the story. I tried to find more about Hancock Lee. It turned out that the Lees were an extensive family, as any of you who know, what do they call it? The first families of Virginia's history would know, and there were several Hancocks. I narrowed it down to two, a father and son, who had a plantation in Fairfax County. And either one of them, when he died, his enslaved people were sold, or the younger one, if he had inherited the enslaved people, ran into a lot of debts, and people would have been seized and sold at auction to pay off his debts. So that's all I could find out. I had trouble trying to locate the plantation or find out anything more. So where did that leave me? Well, not with a lot of information. However, I knew that they had gone to Nantucket, Arthur and Mary. The ship that they were on, the Regulator, was a ship that went back and forth between New Bedford and Alexandria, taking loads of flour to New Bedford. And in one case, in 1817 or 1880, taking a load that included Randolph, George, and George's wife and two children. So we only find that out that they were on board later, but when Samuel Chadwick was nabbed, that's part of the basis for the warrant and the conviction. This is the record I was able to find in the Fairfax courthouse that says Samuel Chadwick, master of the sloop the Regulator, was committed to the jail of the county by warrant so and so and so and so and so and so. And it says Negro slaves, the property of Hancock Lee of this county. Okay, so that's where that information comes from. Now, this is, I think, a placemat in Nantucket, but I didn't have very much information. I was going to New England, and I said, oh, well, why not go up to Nantucket and see if I can find anything up there? There's a chance that there might be something. Well, lo and behold, this is a case where going to Nantucket was a gold mine. It turned out that the story of Arthur and Mary Cooper was a story, they were local heroes in Nantucket, but not in Virginia. Quakers helped save them, and that meant that it became part of the tradition of Nantucket of tolerance for all people. So I found newspaper articles, I found memoirs, I found testimony at a trial from a trial in Boston. I found all kinds of incredible information. And this is just to show you, I don't know if you know where Nantucket is. It's an island and it's off of Massachusetts. It's off of Cape Cod. And it's fairly barren. So what is the major industry in the 19th century? It's whaling. People had to look to the sea, and whaling was a very lucrative industry at that point. And I say industry because the ships went out and they didn't just haul the whales back. They converted the whales into oil while they were at sea. So it was an industrial operation. Now, I'm going to get to what I think is the best part of the story. It's the morning of August 24th, 1822. There's a house on Nantucket where the Coopers live, and it's early in the morning, and it is surrounded by Black men, women, and children. The word had gotten out in the Black community that there were slave catchers on the island, and they were after the Coopers. So this group came to protect the Coopers. And then word was gotten out by a Black cowherd, a herder of cows, got the word to some of the white Quakers in the community, and they came. And so there was a very ominous crowd. This crowd was not a happy crowd, as you can imagine. And a couple of the Quakers set up people at the back of the house and people at the front of the house. And the agent from the slave owner and the two constables from Boston came to arrest the Coopers and take them back to slavery. So the crowd is standing there, and the people who have been sent to the back as guards start getting taunted, and they get more and more frightened. And so they give up their posts and they go to the front of the house. Okay, what's happening in the front of the house? Well, in the front of the house, there is the slave catcher's agent and the two constables, and they've presented themselves, and someone whom they presume to be the leader of the gang, who is a white Quaker and may not have been the leader of the gang, but he was white and he seemed to be a distinguished type, starts haranguing them and saying, well, who are you, and what papers do you have, and what proof do you have that you have come to the right place, and read us what you have, and tell us, and what are you doing in Massachusetts to begin with? Massachusetts is a free state, and Nantucket welcomes African Americans and needs them for its whaling ships, et cetera, et cetera. So the whole thing is being drawn out as long as possible. And once the people at the front of the house realize that there are no guards in the back, guess who escapes out a window? It's not only Arthur Cooper, whom they disguise, and this slide is to show you what a Quaker outfit would look like. There were typical black hats and dark clothing, a typical kind of coat. And so Arthur was given a hat and a coat to wear, and then his wife and children were handed out through the window and then carried over fences to the house of one of the Quakers, where they hid until the agent and the two constables left the island. Now, this was a coup because obviously the slave catcher was not successful, but also because there were 4 children who were taken out the window and taken over the fences and taken to be hidden. And Mary was 9 months pregnant. So a week after this is all happening, she has a new baby. So this is the story of the Coopers. What happened to them? Well, Mary died young. If you go back to the tombstone, she died in the 1820s, but her husband lived to the 1850s. He remarried when she died, and he raised his children, and he was interested in Black rights. He was president of a convention that opposed colonization in Africa for free Blacks. The free Blacks felt that what the United States or the United Colonies were their country. Well, by 1820, it would have been the United States. And he also became involved in supporting schooling for Black children. We don't know if he ever became literate, but his name is on 3 petitions for Black rights. And he certainly seems to have gotten his education for his children. Okay, I don't know, how am I doing on time?
Well, actually, we're just a little bit over time. It's a little bit after 4.
Okay, well, I'll just throw this in. This is the family Bible, and it shows the children that were born to the Coopers. And from the dates, you can figure out who was born and was on the ship with them when they were escaping, and who was born in Nantucket Free. Okay, this is my email if anybody wants to contact me. And now I guess is question and answer.
Thank you so much, Jenny. That was absolutely fascinating. Really appreciate it. Let's open it up to questions. I don't see any questions in the chat. But if anybody would like to just unmute yourselves and ask away.
Hi, yes. Thank you for the opportunity to listen to this really interesting information, and you have done remarkable research. It was a great presentation. I have a question. I just went to a talk that was given by an Arlington County historian on history of enslaved in Arlington. And one of the things that she felt was a new piece of information to her was how the advertisements for fugitive slaves, the freedom seekers, she felt that many of them were, from Arlington anyway, were going to DC, for instance, to meet with family, and that she felt there was a distinction between people who were really running away permanently, so freedom seekers, versus people who had left Arlington County to meet up with family. Do you have any perspective on that? I just found that was curious.
Well, I think it's a very good point for her to have made. I think we don't really know what they did. We know where they had contacts. And like anybody, you would go where there's a contact. If you can stay there, then you can be closer to family and friends who are still enslaved, but you're at risk. So you have to think about what the risk is for you, and if you have children, what the risk is for them. So I don't think we always know. We know what's in the runaway ad, but we don't know what happened to the people. That's where the research is needed. And some people we will never know, but there are genealogists who are trying to trace families back. And so that's what I would say about what she said. I don't disagree with her. Alexandria had a fairly large Black population. I don't think it was as big as Washington or Baltimore. And there's a lot known about Alexandria because of the fact that the archaeologist, who was Pamela Cressy, had a research strategy where she went to William Still's book, she looked up people from Alexandria, and then she tried to find where they lived, and then, if possible, do archaeology on the site and look at local records. So that's one way you can try and track people back, but you have to come up with something ingenious. So
Thank you for that. We have another question, an intriguing question in the chat. The person is wondering what happened to, we think his name is John Parker, the gentleman who inadvertently sailed south instead of north and bumped into his owner in the street in New Orleans.
Well, there is a book that's been published because he did newspaper interviews. He eventually ended up in Ohio, in Ripley, Ohio, which is right across from Kentucky, right across the Ohio River. And he became somebody active on the Underground Railroad. So that's how we know his story. Because of course there could have been people who ran into their owners and that was the last we'd ever hear of them. So I recommend you look for the book on John Parker.
Thank you for the recommendation. I don't see any other questions in the chat. We can, if anyone wants to just unmute yourselves, we'll take one final question before closing. Okay, I'm not hearing anyone with questions, so I think maybe because we've gone over. I would like to thank you so very, very much, Jenny. This was outstanding and truly fascinating. And I'd also like to thank you for your dedication and scholarly research and documenting these stories, stories, quote unquote. These are amazing. Your work is amazing, and it's greatly appreciated to bring some of these unknown people, unsung heroes to life for us and to preserve their stories for history. This was wonderful. Thank you. Really appreciate it. Okay, if we have a thank you in the couple thank yous in the chat for Jenny, and I guess at that we'll call it a day. Thank you very, very much, Jenny. We so appreciate your kindness and generosity with your time and knowledge and expertise. Thank you. We really appreciate it. Okay, everybody, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your being with us, and thank you all. See you the next time. Take care. Be well. Bye-bye.